Mr. Alan Dershowitz joins us now. He is Professor Emeritus of Harvard Law School and host of The Dersh Show, wherever you get your podcasts. Alan Dershowitz, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
So tell me what your thoughts are on the election and how it's being handled right now.
Well, there are two kinds of lawsuits. There are the wholesale and the retail. The wholesale is reflected in the Pennsylvania case, where you have a legal challenge, a crystal clear legal challenge. The legislature said that ballots that are submitted before Election Day have to be received before the end of Election Day. The courts said no, there are 3 extra days. The Constitution says only the legislature can make those decisions, not the courts. So that's a clean, clear, wholesale constitutional issue that the Supreme Court could resolve in a week. The case has already been filed in the Supreme Court. It just has to be refiled. And I think this Supreme Court would probably rule in favor of President Trump on that issue.
So wait. How would somebody rule against? The Constitution is clear. It's the legislature. And didn't the Supreme Court already rule in another case that the legislature had to do it and not the state officials?
Yeah, in Bush versus Gore, they kind of suggested that. And there was a 4-4 vote previously on the Pennsylvania case, and Justice Alito demanded that the votes that came in late after the close of Election Day had to be segregated, strongly implying that the court would rule in that direction. Look, there is a legal argument on the other side. The legal argument would go something like this. Of course, the Constitution says the legislature has to do it, but traditionally courts interpret legislation. The answer to that is this wasn't really an interpretation. This was an expansion in light of COVID, and probably the court would rule that expansion would have to come from the legislative, not the judicial branch. But the question is, does that get him enough votes? Right now, it seems like he may be as much as 60,000 votes behind. So the number of disputed ballots under this particular law has to exceed 60,000 before it could turn around the election. Now, if you combine that wholesale attack with some retail attacks, by retail I mean, a few fraudulent ballots here and there, dead people voting, people who moved out of the state voting, you could conceivably get to a point where the Pennsylvania vote would go the other way. Now, you'd need more than that, because the goal of the Trump legal team is not to give Trump 270 votes. That's out of the question. The goal is to keep Biden from getting 270 so that the election is thrown into the House of Representatives. The way to stop Biden from getting 270, according to the legal team, would be to have challenges in enough states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, maybe Arizona, Nevada, to bring him from 305 to 268, 267. If he doesn't get 270, it goes to the House, and the House votes by delegation. That is, each state gets one vote, and there are now more Republican delegations than there are Democratic delegations. So that's the theory. I'm not saying I'm advocating it. I'm not saying I think it will win. I'm just telling you that's the only route to victory at this point that I can see.
Wow.
So Alan, you're saying that the Trump legal team says that their theory is they cannot get to 270 electoral votes?
I'm just speculating. I don't see how they could get affirmatively to 270, but they don't need it. All they need is to stop Biden from getting 270. That's the key. That's what happened in 1824 in the Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams matter. It's what happened essentially when we had the Tilden Hayes dispute. There are 3 instances in the 19th century where something like this happened. And then, of course, if you follow through the Jackson-Adams 1824, what happens? Jackson loses that, even though he won the popular and the electoral vote. And then for the next 4 years, he campaigned against, quote, the corrupt bargain, and he wins in 1828 and serves for 8 years.
So let me go over this again with you. So he just needs to bring Biden down to 269 even.
Right.
And then it goes to the House. And the House, they use delegations. It's not just a straight vote. So how is that?
That's right.
How is that selected? What does that mean?
Every delegation, say, take Georgia, it may have, I don't know, 18, 12, 13, whatever members of Congress. If there are more Republican members of Congress from Georgia than Democrats, then the state gets to cast its vote for the Republican candidate. And the vote, all it needs is 51 states. So if you win 51-49 in the House of Representatives, then, or in that case, it would be in the House of Representatives, no, you'd have 50 states. So you'd have to win 26 votes. And if you get 26 votes, you elect the president. And that happened in the past. Thomas Jefferson was elected by the House of Representatives, not by the Electoral College.
How do you stop? I mean, how did they stop civil war at that point?
The Constitution doesn't provide for that. In fact, we had a civil war in 1860 because the Constitution didn't provide for that. I would hope good sense, common sense would prevail, and neither side would resort to arms. But I suspect that if you had that situation, there would be some violence. I have no doubt about that.
Alan, if you say to try to lower Biden from 306 to say 269, those electoral votes then don't. What would happen to those? If you're saying they're not affirmatively going to get Trump over 260 or 270, what happens to those electoral votes?
The Electoral College becomes irrelevant. The Constitution puts the Electoral College aside and says we now have it in the House of Representatives. So the Electoral College vote is a null and void.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay, so hang on just a second. But those cases, wouldn't they be decided? I mean, during Bush v. Gore, the Supreme Court made decisive moves that really sewed it up before the states had to send their Electoral College.
Yep. Had they not done that, had the Supreme Court deferred its decision, the case might have gone, the matter might have gone to the House of Representatives because neither candidate would have gotten 270. And that's what happened in the 3 19th century elections that I referred to, actually 4, Jefferson as well, that no candidate. Remember, in those days, you'd have 4 or 5 candidates running. In 1824, you had Henry Clay, you had somebody else, so I think there were 5 candidates, and they divided the electoral vote. Jackson got the most votes, but he didn't get half. According to the Constitution, you need a clear majority. If you don't get a clear majority, it goes to the House.
So one more on this. So if the courts, it behooves, if you want this, and I think this would be really a powder keg that I wouldn't want to see lit.
No doubt.
But if you wanted this to happen, it would behoove you then to file late or to keep the courts somehow or another tied up. Is that right? Because after, the 13th of December, are you saying that then it just automatically triggers?
You don't have to file late. Remember, the wholesale suits can be decided on legal principles without a trial. But if you claim there were 10,000 invalid ballots, or if you follow what Sidney Powell said yesterday on Fox News, and you challenge the computer, saying the computers turned many votes that were supposed to be for Trump to Biden, that's the argument. If you make that argument, you have to prove it. So that's an evidentiary argument, and that requires a trial. And if the court set down for trial all the challenged ballots in 4 or 5 states, you might accomplish that purpose because you couldn't have a trial and a result probably between now and mid-December. So you don't have to delay. All you have to do is ask for a trial. And under the 7th Amendment to the Constitution, you have a right to trial by jury in any cases that were tried by jury at common law. So it becomes very complicated. Look, if I were teaching at Harvard now again, I stopped teaching 5 years ago, I retired, I would be teaching an entire seminar on this election. It raises so many intriguing constitutional questions. I'm not advocating any particular result. I'm just giving you my constitutional analysis.
The odds you think this might happen?
Very low. You'd need a perfect storm. You'd need enough states where there were enough challenges to make the difference, and so that the courts would refuse, or the secretaries of state, some of which are Republican, would refuse to certify the votes so that the electors could be chosen. It would require a perfect storm of both judicial, electoral, and political considerations to come together, and the odds are very low. But it's the only possible road that President Trump has to victory, and it's a very unlikely one, which leads me to believe that he should. I'm not suggesting he secede or concede. I'm not suggesting that he stop his challenges, but I am strongly suggesting that he allow cooperation with the transition team, because the likely outcome is going to be President Biden on January 20th. And if that is likely, there's no good reason why the transition can't go forward while the challenges are still being made and no concession is offered.
The media says that, once they call an election, they call an election.
Well,
but they don't call it. Yeah, they don't call the election. This is just
Biden is not officially the president-elect until and unless enough states certify the election result or the other candidate concedes. You don't get a president-elect through CNN or through Fox or through MSNBC. You get a presumptive president. You call it what you want, but it's immediate term. Legally, the president-elect is picked only when those two circumstances are met. That is, sufficient states certify or the other side concedes. Neither of those things has happened yet.
And when you look at what the media is also saying about this is unheard of, that we don't do things like this in America. We've asked for recounts, and we have challenged elections, not necessarily in the modern era or the late modern era, as much as we did in the first 150 years, right?
That's right. But we have also Bush versus Gore was a direct challenge. Look, I don't condemn the lawyers for doing this. I got an email the other day asking me to sign a petition to disbar the lawyers who are raising these issues. Just nonsense. People wanted to disbar me because I defended President Trump on the floor of the United States Senate. You don't disbar lawyers for doing their job. I don't condemn the lawyers who are raising these arguments. They may lose, they may win. Even I've lost some cases. That's what happens. You don't always win your cases. You try your best to win. Look, every day I've been dealing with this complicated issue on my show, The Dersh Show, and I've been getting these intriguing calls from people coming up with interesting ideas for how to deal with this from both sides of the aisle, from the Democratic side and the Republican side. And it's a fascinating issue. I think in the end, the victories that Trump receives will be Pyrrhic victories. He'll receive some victories, Pennsylvania, maybe other places, but they probably won't be enough to stop Vice President Biden from hitting the magic 270.